The sun had barely climbed above the horizon when Jesse Clay rode out toward Dead Horse Ridge, his saddle creaking with each stride of his chestnut gelding. A bitter wind came down from the mesa, kicking dust across the prairie and slicing through the seams of his coat. Jesse had been raised to believe the land belonged to men with papers and fences, men like the cattle baron who had hired him. The rancher who now owned this stretch of earth had sent Jesse to deal with a problem near the north boundary. An old Apache man had built a crude shelter near the spring, and word around town said he was refusing to leave. Jesse didn't ask questions. He'd spent most of his life pushing cattle, keeping to himself, and obeying orders. What mattered was the brand he wore on his belt buckle and the rifle slung behind his saddle. But as he neared the ridge, something in the air shifted. It wasn't just the cold, it was stillness, a natural and deep, the kind of silence that warned men to tread carefully. As he crested a low hill, Jesse finally spotted the so-called intruder. The man sat cross-legged near a small fire, surrounded by stones, carefully placed in a circle. He looked old, ancient, even his hair was white, long, and tied at the base of his neck. His skin, weathered and darkened by the sun, seemed carved from the same earth he sat on. In his lap rested a flat stone, and with a small brush, he painted strange symbols in ochre and ash. Jesse reined in his horse about 20 feet away. "You're on private land," he called out, voice firm. "You need to pack up and leave." The elder didn't even look up. He dipped his brush into a small bowl and continued painting. The silence stretched too long. Jesse shifted uncomfortably in the saddle, then dismounted with a grunt, dust puffing from his boots as they hit the ground. "I said," he repeated, stepping closer, "you're trespassing. This is cattle land now. My boss wants it cleared." This time, the old man stopped painting. Slowly, he raised his eyes and met Jesse's. They were dark, but not dull. There was no fear in them, only patience, the kind of patience that came from decades of watching rivers change course, herds disappear, and governments rise and fall. "I was here before your grandfather's grandfather," the man said quietly, his voice raspy like dry leaves scraping stone. Jesse stiffened. He was used to being obeyed, not defied. "I've got orders," he said, "and you don't have any right to this place anymore." The elder said nothing. Instead, he looked past Jesse to the horizon, where the mountains met the sky, and whispered something in Apache words Jesse couldn't understand. Then the man turned back and locked eyes again with him. "My son comes," he said. Jesse frowned. "Your what?" The elder repeated the phrase. "My son comes." It didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a truth. Jesse felt his fingers twitch near his holster, unsure why. The old man hadn't moved. He posed no visible danger. But something about the way he sat, so calm, so rooted, unnerved Jesse more than any outlaw he'd ever faced. He looked around. There was no one else, no weapons drawn, just this old man and the wind, whispering through the sagebrush. "I don't want any trouble," Jesse said, the edge in his voice softening ever so slightly. The elder nodded once, then returned to his painting, as if Jesse had already become irrelevant to the moment, as if something far greater was on its way. And the cowboy standing before him was just another footnote in a long memory the land refused to forget. The tension between the two men thickened like heat rising off sun-baked stone. Jesse Clay, arms crossed and jaw tight, stood in the quiet shadow of the canyon ridge, while the elder Apache dipped his brush into a bowl and calmly finished the last stroke on his stone canvas. The wind had died completely now, as if the world itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Jesse didn't like the silence. It made him feel like he'd already lost control of the situation without ever drawing his gun or giving an ultimatum. He stepped forward, boots crunching lightly over the gravel, stopping just outside the circle of stones around the fire. "I told you once already," Jesse said, louder this time. "This isn't your land anymore. My boss bought it fair and legal." He pointed toward the west with a jerky nod. "There's a wire fence 2 miles from here. Everything between here and the creek is company property now. That means you're trespassing." The old man didn't look up this time. He blew gently on the drying paint, the patterns on the stone catching the early sunlight spirals, arrows, and waves etched with care and a jeweled memory. Then he reached down and tossed a few pieces of dry wood into the fire. They snapped and popped in the growing flames, filling the silence with a low crackle. Jesse took another step closer. His hand moved instinctively toward his revolver, not to draw, but to rest there. It was a habit born of years riding trails and dealing with desperate men. He didn't feel threatened, not exactly, but something about the elder's stillness rattled him. It was the kind of stillness you only saw in the mountains, after a storm, or in the eyes of a man who had survived more than he'd ever tell. "Did you hear what I said, old man?" Jesse snapped, the frustration finally creeping into his voice. "You don't belong here, not anymore." This time the elder raised his head slowly. His face was deeply lined, the skin drawn taut over high cheekbones, and his eyes, those eyes were dark and heavy with memory. He didn't speak at first. He just stared at Jesse until the younger man shifted his feet uncomfortably, unsure whether to raise his voice again or back away. Finally, in a voice that seemed to carry across lifetimes, the old man said, "You carry orders like stones in a sack. But stones don't listen, they only fall." Jesse squinted, confused. What does that mean? The elder gestured toward the horizon. You speak of ownership, but this land listens to no man. It remembers. It remembers who bled on it, who prayed on it, who fed their children from its roots. It remembers fire and wind, broken promises, and buried names. Jesse frowned. Look, I don't have time for riddles. I'm not here to argue over the past. I'm just doing my job. The elder gave a slow nod. Yes, you do what you're told, as many have before you. But understand this, my presence here is not a challenge. It is a return. And you are not the first to try to erase us with deeds and fences. There was no bitterness in his tone, just solemn certainty. Jesse felt something inside him shift. A sliver of doubt, maybe, or guilt. He didn't know. But the man's words dug deeper than they should have. Then, once again, the elder spoke those same 4 words. My son is coming. Jesse's chest tightened. What do you mean, your son is coming? The old man didn't reply. He looked to the north again, toward the hills, his face unreadable. The flames between them danced in the breeze that had returned with the sunlight. Jesse followed his gaze, seeing only sky and sagebrush. You expecting trouble? Jesse asked. Warily. The elder gave no answer, just silence. But it wasn't an empty silence, it was deliberate, heavy with meaning. A silence that said, the next part of this story is no longer yours to control. Jesse stepped back, suddenly unsure of everything. This wasn't what he expected. He thought he'd find a broken-down trespasser he could scare off with a warning or 2. Instead, he found a man who had rooted himself deeper into the earth than any fence post ever could. And now, someone else was coming. Jesse stood by the edge of the elder's fire circle, boot heels planted firmly in the sand, heart pounding just a little faster now. That phrase kept echoing in his mind. My son is coming. He glanced again toward the north, but the desert stretched on, silent and bare beneath the rising sun. Just more hills, more rock, more dry brush waving in the breeze. Still, he felt something. Not fear exactly, but an uneasiness creeping up his spine, as though the wind itself had turned into a whispering voice, urging him to pay attention. And then, it came. At first, Jesse mistook the sound for a dust devil, distant, rhythmic, but as it grew louder, more solid, he knew better. Hooves, not just 1 or 2 horses either. A lot. The sound swelled with each second, dull thuds, rolling over the hard earth in a steady cadence, rising and falling like a drumbeat. Jesse squinted against the glare and stared north again. They're just cresting the ridge figures. On horseback, they came in waves. First 3, then 5, then more. Riders cutting through the orange morning light like shadows with purpose. Jesse's breath caught in his throat. He counted at least a dozen at first, then more, streaming in behind. They rode in quiet, disciplined formation, not a word shouted between them. Some were men, bare-chested and painted, long hair flowing in the wind. Others were women wrapped in patterned shawls, and children clinging to their waists or riding in slings. Their faces were unreadable, their posture proud. At the front of the column, one rider broke away and advanced with speed. He was younger, maybe, in his 30s, his jaw sharp, his eyes unwavering. His face was marked with ochre paint in vertical lines, and a single hawk feather stood upright in his braid. He wore no rifle, no pistol, only a hunting knife at his belt and a rawhide strap around his chest. He stopped his horse within a breath of Jesse. The dust kicked up by his mount swirled between them in a dry cyclone, making Jesse blink and step back instinctively. The man didn't dismount, didn't blink, didn't speak. Jesse found his voice. Are you his son? He asked, tilting his chin toward the elder, who still sat cross-legged behind him, painting another symbol as calmly as before. The rider nodded once. Jesse's hand hovered near his hip again, not in threat but in confusion. I don't want no fight, he muttered. The man's voice, when it finally came, was calm and low. Then don't act like a man preparing for one. That silenced Jesse. Around them, the other riders began to fan out across the rocky flat. Some dismounted and began unpacking blankets, clay jars, and small bundles wrapped in animal skin. Others led horses to the stream nearby. Children laughed softly as they ran, and a few of the women began humming a song old as the soil, haunting and melodic. It wasn't a war party, it was something else. A return. Jesse stared, dumbfounded. What is this? He asked, more to himself than anyone else. The son dismounted then, walking past him without another word. He knelt beside the elder, touching his forehead gently to the old man's shoulder, gesture Jesse had never seen before, reverent and powerful in its simplicity. The elder didn't stop painting, but his hand rested momentarily on his son's head. Fingers threaded through the braid like a blessing passed from one generation to another. Jesse felt like an intruder, a man who had stumbled into a private ceremony he couldn't understand. He turned in a slow circle, watching the growing activity unfold like a tapestry coming to life. These people weren't just visiting. They weren't camping. They were home. The strange part was no one was angry, no one accused him, no one raised a weapon, and yet Jesse had never felt more outnumbered, more out of place, or more humbled in his life. From behind him, the elder finally spoke again. Voice calm and steady. "You came to deliver a message. Now stay and hear one." Jesse didn't know what to say. He stood frozen in place, surrounded by dozens of faces, some curious, some indifferent, none afraid. He realized then that this wasn't about him. It never had been. He wasn't the center of this story. It was just a man who'd been sent to draw a line in the sand dolly to discover the sand already carried centuries of footprints, and more were arriving. Jesse didn't sit, but his legs wanted to. The pressure in his knees, the sudden weight of uncertainty, all began to settle in his body like dust after a cattle stampede. He stood stiffly, watching as the Apache clan moved with silent coordination, turning the open land around the elder's fire into a living village. Blankets were laid out, bundles opened, food shared. 2 young girls knelt at the stream bank cupping water into carved bowls. An old woman stirred something in a blackened pot hanging above a separate fire. Nobody asked permission. Nobody asked questions. They had come like wind across an old trail, natural, inevitable, unannounced. Jesse tried to tell himself he was still in charge, that this was still ranch land, that if he gave the word, men would ride out from the McAllister spread with rifles across their saddles, but a strange truth had begun to root itself inside him, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't tear it free. These people didn't need to ask for the land, they were the land. Their arrival wasn't a trespass. It was a return to something deeper than boundaries written in English or barbed wire strung across prairie. The elder sat in the same place, brushing another symbol onto a stone slab. His son sat nearby, legs crossed, calmly sharpening a knife. With a long whetstone, Jesse watched him, unsure whether the motion was ceremonial or preparatory. It was impossible to read the man's face. There was no hostility, no bravado, only presence, like a tree weathering every kind of storm. "Is he always this quiet?" Jesse finally asked, unable to keep the question in. His voice sounded strange, now narrow, thin, small. The elder looked up. "He listens more than he speaks," he said. "Like the wind. You cannot see it, but it tells you when something is coming." Jesse nodded slightly, then rubbed the back of his neck. He took a few steps toward the fire but stopped outside the circle of stones. "Look," he said cautiously, "I was just sent to ask questions. I didn't mean to stir up anything." The elder motioned toward a flat stone. "Then sit and listen. Most men speak before they understand where they stand." For a long moment, Jesse hesitated. 100 thoughts tangled inside him about loyalty, duty, ranch laws, and pride. But something about the moment pressed him downward. Gently but firmly he stepped over the ring of stones and sat, not out of submission, but out of some quiet instinct that told him this was no ordinary gathering. The old man pointed to the symbol on the stone he'd been painting. "Do you know what this is?" Jesse squinted. It looked like a spiral sun, with 3 lines branching from it. A star. He guessed that the elder shook his head. "It is a memory. This means fire that gave life. These marks," he gestured with his brush, "mean journey. Generations. This was once drawn on cave walls before men brought their papers and maps. It tells of how we came from the mountains, how we lost brothers to hunger and war, and how we found water when it seemed the world had dried out." Jesse's lips parted slightly, his breath slow and shallow. "Symbols are stories," the elder continued, "and stories are not just for telling, they are for keeping, for surviving." A boy came and offered Jesse a bowl of warm corn mash, thick and sweet, with herbs. Jesse took it awkwardly, nodding in thanks. The child returned to the others without a word, and Jesse stared into the bowl for a moment before tasting it. It was earthy, rich and like anything he'd had in the ranch cookhouse. "You believe land can be bought," the elder said, voice low. "But what if it's not for sale? What if it remembers the names of its first keepers?" Jesse met his eyes again. For the first time, he felt something shift, not outside, but within. His father used to say, "A man owns what he can protect." But what if the land didn't want protecting? What if it just wanted remembering? The elder held up the stone again, his hand steady. "Tell your boss this isn't a protest. This is remembrance, and remembrance can't be fenced off." The wind stirred again, and for the first time, Jesse noticed that even the birds had returned, hawks circling overhead, as if drawn to something sacred awakening in the dust. Jesse didn't remember when he stopped thinking like a foreman and started listening like a guest. The change had crept up on him, gradually, no sudden epiphany, no sharp moment of clarity, just a quiet understanding that had grown with every fire crackle, every rustle of shawls, every softly spoken word passed among the Apache gathered there. He wasn't sure how long he'd been sitting beside the elder now, maybe an hour, maybe more, but the urgency that had driven him there had all but dissolved. In its place was something harder to define: reverence, discomfort, humility. He watched as the clan continued their silent work. A teenage girl braided corn husks into strands and hung them between two rocks. An older man with a bent back spread tobacco leaves on a blanket and arranged them in a pattern. Nearby, the elder's son tended to a bundle of cedar, pine, and juniper, feeding a small ceremonial fire. The scent drifted through the air clean, biting, ancient. Jesse inhaled deeply. His mind stirred by memories he didn't own. He thought back to what the elder had said. This is remembrance. Not protest, not defiance, not rebellion. Just the act of existing, in place, of speaking without words. And in that silence, Jesse realized, there was power. Not the kind you carried in a holster, or signed into a deed, but a deeper, older kind, rooted in stories passed down over firelight, and silence endured in dignity. Suddenly, the elder turned toward him, as if sensing the thought in Jesse's mind. You were not raised for this kind of moment, he said gently. That is not your fault. Jesse looked at him. What kind of moment? The elder paused, brushing a streak of white onto another stone. The kind where history doesn't bend to your comfort. Jesse let that settle before responding. So what do? I can't go back and tell them I just sat and watched a fire while 50 people settled on company land. The elder nodded slowly. You can say you delivered the message. And that you received one. A lump formed in Jesse's throat. The elder's calm made it harder, not easier. He wasn't being threatened. He wasn't being argued with. And yet, he felt more shaken than if a dozen rifles had been pointed his way. From across the clearing, a woman approached. She carried a bundle, wrapped in cloth and tied with leather cords. Without a word, she knelt before Jesse and placed it gently at his feet. Then she arose and walked away. Jesse glanced down. It was a stone, about the size of his hand, painted with the same spiral and line work the elder had been drawing. But this one also had something else, 3 small dots in a row beneath the spiral. Jesse picked it up, turning it slowly. The elder spoke again. You're the third messenger to come here in my lifetime. The first came with a treaty. The second came with a gun. You came with confusion. Jesse blinked. What do the dots mean? They mean choice, the 3 paths left to you. To deny, to forget, or to carry. He stared at the stone, feeling its weight in his hand. It was heavier than it looked. Behind them, the sun had fully risen now, stretching golden light. Over the wide basin, the clan members began gathering together near the fire again, forming a semicircle behind the elder and his son. No one called to Jesse. No one motioned for him to leave. But the atmosphere shifted. He could feel the circle closing, not to push him out, but to mark a space he did not yet belong to. The elder rose, his bones stiff but his stance proud. He looked to Jesse one last time. You don't need to understand everything, but you must carry something back. Jesse stood, brushing the dust from his jeans. He didn't know if he should thank them, or bow, or offer something in return. So he did the only thing that felt right. He nodded, once with every ounce of sincerity he had, and he turned to leave. The painted stone stayed in his pocket, warm from the fire. Jesse's horse stood patiently under the shade of a juniper tree, its reins loosely tied to a branch, as if it, too, had been waiting for something deeper than the rider's return. Jesse approached slowly, brushing his fingers along the saddle horn, still lost in thought. The stone in his pocket pressed against his thigh with quiet weight. Not unlike the look in the elder's eyes, unflinching, unmovable, impossible to ignore. He mounted without a word and guided the horse westward, away from the gathering and the sacred fire that still glowed faintly behind him. The hoofbeats fell in rhythm with his breathing, but his mind wandered, looping endlessly around the scene he'd just left. The Apache hadn't tried to stop him. No warning shots, no angry stares. They didn't need to say anything. They knew their message had been delivered not in speeches or threats, but in how they stood, how they looked at the land, how they belonged there without needing permission. Jesse rode in silence for miles, the horizon shimmering with heat and memory. His usual confidence had thinned to something more fragile, introspective, cautious. He kept replaying the elder's words. You can say you delivered the message, and that you received one. But what exactly was the message? That the land held older memories than barbed wire, that stories could settle in the earth like seeds, waiting for the right season to bloom again. That his people hadn't just built fences, they'd erased things they never tried to understand. He wasn't sure how the McAllister brothers were going to take that answer. By late afternoon, Jesse crested the final ridge before the ranch house came into view. The familiar sight of the barn, bunkhouse, and wide porch didn't bring the comfort it usually did. Instead, everything felt quieter, smaller, as if something had shifted in him. And now, even home looked different. 2 of the hands were already waiting at the corral, rifles slung but relaxed. McAllister himself, Tom, the elder brother, stood near the fence post, chewing on a reed and squinting into the sun. Took you long enough, Tom said, his voice dry and even. Jesse dismounted. Dust clung to his boots, his jeans, his face. Had a long conversation, he muttered, patting his horse. With who? One of the ranch hands asked. They still there? Jesse nodded. Yeah, the whole clan. Tom raised an eyebrow. You tell the old man we're claiming that basin? That we got surveyor's cumin next month? I told him, Jesse replied. Reaching into his pocket, he held up the painted stone and handed it over. And he gave me this. Tom took it, turning it in his calloused fingers. His expression soured. What the hell is this? Art project. Jesse didn't smile. It's a message. What's it say? It says they remember. That they're not leaving. That they don't need permission to be somewhere they've already been for generations. Tom scoffed, tossing the stone to one of the ranch hands, who caught it with a shrug. Well, that don't hold in court. Maybe not, Jesse said, wiping the sweat from his brow. But out there, court don't matter. Only memory. There was a pause long and Tom narrowed his eyes. You sound like you've been converted or something. You forget who you work for. Jesse met his gaze. No, I didn't forget. I just remembered something I didn't know I knew, which is, Jesse looked off toward the ridge, where the basin lay just out of sight, where fires still flickered and children played near ancient stones, that some things don't belong to us, he said softly. No matter what paper we got in the drawer. Tom stepped forward, jaw tightening. You go in soft, Jess. No, Jesse said, just seeing clearer. Tom opened his mouth, but didn't speak. Something in Jesse's voice, low, steady, rooted, stopped him. Maybe it was the same tone the elder had used. Maybe it was the sound of a man who wasn't looking to fight, but wouldn't back down either. Jesse turned and walked toward the bunkhouse, the stone still warm in his hand, the fire still burning in his memory. That evening, the bunkhouse was quieter than usual. The poker game went unplayed, the usual laughter and guitar picking absent. Jesse sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at the painted stone on the small wooden table beside his bed. The spiral, in the center, caught the lamplight, glowing faintly like a distant sun. The 3 dots beneath it representing choice seemed to pulse with quiet intensity. He wasn't the only one disturbed. Word of what Jesse had seen had already spread across the ranch by supper time. Some of the younger cowhands, curious and impressionable, had asked questions. Others, more hardened by years of line work and loyalty to McAllister, dismissed the Apache gathering as a stunt. But Jesse could tell something had been stirred, like a flame carried on wind. The elder's message was catching light in places no one expected. One of the older hands, Clay, a grizzled man with missing teeth and a crooked leg, approached Jesse after supper. Heard they set up camp, like it was theirs, he said, arms folded. They didn't set up, Jesse replied. They returned. Clay squinted at him. You sayin' they got a claim stronger than paper? Jesse nodded slowly. I'm sayin' they got a claim deeper than paper. Clay didn't speak for a while. Then he scratched his chin. My granddaddy used to say this land drank blood before it drank rain. Maybe it remembers that. Jesse looked up, surprised. By the man's words, that sounds about right. Clay walked away without another word, but the way he moved slower, more thoughtful told Jesse the fire had touched him too. Meanwhile, back in the ranch house, the McAllister brothers were growing restless. Tom paced the floor, stopping only to glare out the window toward the dark outline of the ridges where the Apache clan had gathered. His younger brother, Hank, sat at the table, flipping through the land documents and maps with irritation. Believe him, Hank muttered. All that talk about memory and stories, we paid for that land. Got it recorded in the county. End of story. Tom didn't answer immediately. He rubbed the back of his neck, then finally said, it's not the end of the story if 50 of them are still sitting out there, staring into a fire like they never left. So what do we do? Tom's jaw tightened. What we always do. We remind them that law still means something. Hank nodded. Pleased. We ride out at dawn. Tom hesitated. We ride out at dawn. But as the clock ticked toward midnight, Jesse stood again under the open sky, the stone in his palm, the prairie stretching before him like a memory waiting to be told. He thought of the elder's son, silent, watchful, sharpening his knife without malice. Not as a threat, but as ritual. Jesse had seen no fear in any of them, only certainty. That certainty now echoed inside him. He knew Tom planned to confront them at sunrise, with rifles and papers. But Jesse also knew what the elder had meant about the 3 paths: to deny, to forget, or to carry. He could no longer deny what he'd seen, and forgetting wasn't an option either, not after looking into the eyes of children dancing beside sacred stones. Not after feeling the weight of silence speak louder than any man he'd met. So that left only one path. To carry. Jesse looked to the east, where the ridgeline met the stars. Somewhere beyond it, the clan still gathered, not because they wanted to fight, but because they refused to vanish. He clenched the stone in his fist, not in anger, but in decision. He would not let the morning turn into another chapter of violence. Not while he still had a voice. Not while the land still listened. The prairie held its breath as dawn approached. A pale band of light stretched thin across the eastern sky, casting the world in ghostly gray. Jesse stood outside the bunkhouse alone, saddle cinched, rifle holstered but untouched. He wore the Same dust-covered clothes from yesterday, and in his palm tight and certain rested the painted Apache stone, the spiral, the 3 dots, the choice. Behind him, the rest of the ranch slowly stirred. Men laced boots, loaded rifles, whispered behind canvas walls. Tom McAllister emerged from the ranch house, flanked by his brother Hank and 2 others, all on horseback, their silhouettes sharp against the waking sky. "We ride now," Tom said. Jesse stepped forward. "Not yet." Tom's brow furrowed. "This ain't up for discussion, Jess. I'm not here to discuss, I'm here to stop it." The tension cracked like a whip in the air. "You think this is your call," Hank snapped. "You've gone soft in the head, sitting with ghosts and talking like you're one of them." "I sat with people," Jesse said, "people with blood and stories and a right to exist on the land they came from." Tom dismounted, walking toward Jesse until only a few feet separated them. "You got 2 choices," he growled. "Step aside or ride with us, and remember where your loyalty lies." Jesse reached into his pocket and held out the stone. "This is my loyalty to what's right." Tom glanced at the stone, but didn't take it. His lips curled. "You think this little rock changes anything?" "No," Jesse said, "but I do." He raised his voice. "You ride out with guns. You'll be writing another chapter like the ones we pretend didn't happen. You think they'll shoot first. They won't, but they will stand. And if they die, they'll do it with more dignity than we'll ever find on a deed." Some of the younger ranch hands had gathered now, watching. A few shifted uncomfortably. One of them, a boy no older than 19, slowly lowered the rifle slung on his back. Jesse looked around, voice firm. "I'm not asking anyone to betray this ranch. I'm asking you to remember something deeper. That this land had a heartbeat before we put fences around it. That justice doesn't always wear a badge." Silence fell. Even the horses seemed to sense it. Tom's eyes locked with Jesse's. There was rage there, but also uncertainty. The kind of uncertainty that creeps in when a truth refuses to stay buried. "You planning to stand between us and them?" Tom asked. "I already am." The sun broke the horizon then, spilling light over the ridge. And in that light, like shadows, turning solid, came the Apache. They didn't arrive as a war party. No war paint, no drums, just presence. The elder walked at the front, his cane steady in one hand, his eyes locked on Jesse in the distance. Behind him came his son, his daughter, and all the rest men, women, children, some carrying baskets, others only silence. They stopped 100 yards from the ranch fence and stood there, unmoving. They were not advancing. They were witnessing. Jesse turned toward them, then looked back at Tom. "You ride now. You ride against them, but you'll also ride against me." For a long moment, no one moved. The tension curled and twisted, held tight in that sunrise space between history and choice. Finally, Tom exhaled, long and slow. He looked away, not at Jesse, not at the Apache, but at the land itself. "We don't shoot today," he muttered, "but this ain't over." "It never was," Jesse replied quietly. Tom mounted again, signaled the others. One by one, the riders turned away from the ridge, some still angry, some merely tired, but none untouched. Jesse remained where he stood, facing the Apache. The elder nodded once, and Jesse nodded back. The spiral had turned. The message had been carried, and the land, at last, seemed to breathe again.